Today I am responding to Jordan B. Peterson's lectures on Nietzsche. This one is entitled Intro to Nietzsche, How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Ostensibly, these lectures are on the topic of Beyond Good and Evil. This video arguably isn't even about Nietzsche, but it's certainly not about Beyond Good and Evil. I didn't encounter a single reference to anything Nietzsche says in Beyond Good and Evil in this entire lecture, this first lecture. Sort of reminds me of the film Troll 2, famous bad movie that is not a sequel to Troll 1 and has no trolls in the movie.
Well, hello everyone. We're going to talk about Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, essentially. That's what I'm going to attempt to cover in this seminar. And so I subtitled this How to Philosophize with a Hammer, and that's actually a quote from Nietzsche.
So it's not just a quote from Nietzsche. That actually comes from, that's the subtitle to The Twilight of Idols.
What does that mean? I think it refers to there are two references implicit in that statement. One is that Nietzsche attempted to break down some of the implicit axiomatic suppositions that had undergirded philosophy prior to the dawn of his thought. And so it's a technical phrase, even though it's poetic, but it's also a psychological phrase, and I think it does refer to the impact that Nietzsche's thought can have on you if you come upon it unaware.
Okay, so it's interesting that he says, even though it's poetic, how to philosophize with a hammer is a technical phrase, there is some truth to that. And he says that on the one hand, it's sort of undermining the axiomatic certainties of, I suppose, Western culture, religion, morality. And the other technical meaning is psychological, the impact that Nietzsche's work is supposed to have. So there is certainly this, we might say, aggressive, almost military aspect to Nietzsche. He uses military metaphors, right? I remember in letters going back and forth with Heinrich Koselleck's Peter Gast about Twilight of Idols, they talk about him driving his artillery up to the highest heights that they've ever been placed. His guns are at the highest vantage points, so they have the best angles to fire. And the first section of Twilight of Idols is called Maxims and Arrows. You could translate it as like maxims and missiles. This idea that Nietzsche is opening fire upon Western civilization. So what I'm about to say is not meant to say that Nietzsche does not have this aggressive sort of antagonistic element to his philosophy, right? But the phrase, how to philosophize with a hammer, where that comes from is from The Twilight of Idols. And in the preface to that work, Nietzsche says that he wishes to strike his hammer against the hollow idols of mankind as one taps with a tuning fork. It's very interesting, right? So the idols of mankind are hollow, and the negative space within them, nevertheless, will chime a certain sound. Sound isn't material, it's not substantive, but it's the certain tone, the overtone of a given idol. And Nietzsche is very explicit elsewhere in his work that idols and ideals are sort of almost interchangeable terms for him. And so we've had these various ideals that are usually represented in a sort of visual or anthropomorphized form, and sort of the form of an idol. And that Nietzsche's goal is going to be to take his hammer that is more like a tuning fork and tap them and hear what tone that they chime. So he's not talking about smashing. Now, obviously, the implications of philosophizing with a hammer lead the mind to think about smashing, aggressive, antagonistic, all of these things, which, again, as I've said, is there. But it's interesting that Jordan doesn't mention, when he says this has a technical meaning, Nietzsche doesn't talk about undermining the axiomatic certainties of Western civilization, even though indeed he does. He doesn't talk about the great impact that his work will have. The actual meaning of how to philosophize with a hammer is sort of sounding out what the inner meaning of an ideal is. What are we might, to phrase that in more concrete terms, what are the ultimate foundational valuations that sit at the basis of that ideal or that idol? So with Christianity, Nietzsche might say that it's something like life denial, otherworldism. At different times, he'll talk about the problems of Christianity in terms of pity or guilt, or ressentiment and the slave morality, But ultimately, I think his problem is that it's a form of valuation that undermines the very act of valuing itself. It's the will aiming at something which undermines willing. What does that mean? It means the ascetic ideal orients itself to the world beyond. After the final judgment, when all accounts are settled, all injustices are sort of balanced, the scales are rebalanced on earth, right? And then we're given a perfect eternal body in heaven. All of the ends that our will has been directed at take place in this other world, which is inaccessible to us while we're alive. And meanwhile, the objects of our will, while we are here in the actual world, in the immediate world of sensation and perception, these are generally circumscribed by the ascetic ideal, or at least it cuts off all avenues towards satisfying the will that don't fit with its moral constraints on humankind, right? So that's just an example of Nietzsche like sounding out the idol of Christianity. Now, does he also want to smash that idol? Sure. It's just a misuse of the term philosophizing with a hammer that's really common, and most people who read Nietzsche, and they read just like a little bit more deeply than the surface level quotes that you see going around, and that sort of just very, again, superficial reading of Nietzsche. Once you go just a little bit beyond that and scratch the surface, you see that certain metaphors, certain images, certain ideas in Nietzsche are often misrepresented, or they're vulgarized in some way. And here we're in not even the first minute of my analysis, and I've talked for a long time, so I'll keep going. But Jordan is recapitulating to all those same impulses of the shallow reading of Nietzsche.
And any singular individual who has a remarkable impact on thought has gone down very deep into the structure of our presuppositions and moved them around. We have this intuition of depth, right? All of us know that there's a difference between something that's shallow and something that's deep. And if something
and I forgot he was
that's shallow
saying
moves,
that, using that metaphor here. But
and if something inside of you that
it's ironic, right? Is that he gives the shallow explanation of what philosophizing with a hammer means, and then waxes poetic about the difference between shallowness and depth.
Of a destruction of axiomatic foundation. Now, he attempted to rebuild something else in its stead, but that's no simple thing, given that the entire edifice of Judeo-Christian thought was a collective endeavor unfolding over thousands and thousands of years.
And so is Nietzsche's philosophical project, by the way. Nietzsche goes back to the Sophists. He goes back to Heraclitus. Many of Nietzsche's own ideas of becoming come from Heraclitus. He's very much opposed to Plato and Socrates, but also draws from their own ideas and really from their example, the example they set as legislators of value. And he's in dialogue with, thinkers from the entirety of this long philosophical project that really begins, at least for Nietzsche, in Greece. People say Athens and Jerusalem, but we don't really get... He's more into the pre-Socratics, which he calls the pre-Platonics, and I think the only one of them who even lives in Athens is Anaxagoras. For Nietzsche, it sort of begins in the Greek world, and he's in dialogue with all of these philosophical figures from that time up until his own. And, Nietzsche is not trying to embark on this revaluation of values as the project of a single lifetime. He says, we require new philosophers of the future. We require these free spirits that I hope are coming up in the future to carry out their own experiments and their own revaluations, which complicates things more too, right? Because Nietzsche isn't imagining, I'm going to set exactly what the new religion is going to be for mankind. In some sense, I'm going to give you the blueprint. I'm going to vivisect the inner workings of how new moralities are legislated, and I hope many experiments will be conducted in legislating new values, and most of them will be failures, right? So that's a very interesting aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy as well. But what I'm trying to get at here is like Nietzsche's dialogue with Kant, with Schopenhauer, with Rousseau, with Montaigne, with Epicurus, with Plato, with La Rochefoucauld, right? The philosophy, too, is a long-standing project that I think Nietzsche interprets through, which I know Jordan knows this because he's done an analysis on a paragraph from Beyond Good and Evil in which Nietzsche's talking about how every philosophy is the involuntary an unconscious memoir of its author. It's their confession of their impulses. But he says it's the moral or immoral germ from which the whole plant of their philosophy has grown. That's what we need to locate to really understand the logic of that philosophy, that the system sort of is sprouts arboreally from this initial moral aim, something like that, or it could just be an impulsive end, but oftentimes the ends of our triumphant impulses are sort of laundered by our consciousness into moral language. In any case, so Nietzsche would say that each of these philosophers was coming up with new ways of, we might say, judging, evaluating, new criteria of judgment, right? So this project of the revaluation, Nietzsche thinks is not something that he just initiates on his own and he's going to complete in a single lifetime. He fully sees that there is a philosophical project, a critical project that's sort of running parallel with these traditional Judeo-Christian values. I'm taking so much time to, yet again, probably an inordinate amount of time to respond to that statement from Jordan, because it's a common Petersonism. It's a common theme with him that, Nietzsche thinks you can reevaluate your values, but these are all sort of very old evolutionary things that we've inherited and we have to discover, so we have to stick to them because it's part of this grand project. Nietzsche's also part of a grand project that develops over thousands of years. So it's not really a fair criticism.
To try to replace something like that in a single lifetime, regardless of your degree of brilliance, is one daunting challenge, and it isn't obvious that Nietzsche succeeded. I mean, it was Nietzsche, of course, who famously pronounced that God was dead and that we have killed him, by the way, and that we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. It wasn't a triumphalist statement. It isn't reasonable to say that it was Nietzsche himself who produced the death of God that plagues our society at the current times, because no one thinker is responsible for a transformation of that magnitude. But it is the case that he was able to synthesize the criticism of Judeo-Christian ethics and bring it to what would you say, to express that more trenchantly and explicitly than anyone else, just like Freud, not so.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say he's going back to that old trope again, that Nietzsche was not triumphant when he announced the death of God, right? And in some ways that's arguably true, but it's not sorrowful, which I've heard Jordan say, that Nietzsche announced the death of God sorrowfully, which is not true either. And there are some passages that do almost read triumphantly. And he always cites the madman passage. I've done a whole video on the death of God idea and on the madman passage and on the various interpretations of it, which you can check out. I've also done a video where I've responded to Jordan Peterson's specific claims about the God is dead phrase. Everyone should go look up the first aphorism of the Gay Science Book 5, which is called What Our Cheerfulness Signifies. And so what does our cheerfulness signify? And Nietzsche says that the old God is dead is a message that the Christian belief has become unworthy of us now. That's what the saying God is dead means to me. What I'm saying is that we simply can't believe in Christianity anymore. But then he goes on to say that in spite of all the dangers of this and the societal upheaval, never before has such an open sea of possibilities existed for new valuations. And ultimately for Nietzsche, that's good news, because he sees the Christian monotheistic worldview, the moralization of our existence, as essentially life-denying and a long process of exhaustion which has done immense harm to the human race. And furthermore, because of its universalism and its dogmatism, it's even closed off the possibilities, unlike in polytheism, where new gods can be born and new gods can be brought in with a whole panoply of existing gods, and there can be a more free contest of values. Nietzsche sees a kind of stultifying complacency in Christianity that even prevents future revaluations. It's just disingenuous to present it as if Nietzsche is weeping over the death of God. That's not really the vibe. He is, it's a danger, yes, but it's also an opportunity. And you need to look at more passages than just the madman passage. That's not the first passage where Nietzsche speaks of the death of God, and it's not the last. He brings it up at least 4 times in the Gay Science alone, And he brings it up in Thus Spoke Zarathustra as well. So, yeah.
Long afterwards, Nietzsche knew, for example, that one of the consequences of that there would be two consequences of the death.
And this is another problem I have with Jordan, is that he basically said Nietzsche was successful at destroying the axiomatic certainties of the Western philosophical project. Well, if that's true, then the response can't be we should just go back to those certainties or hold on to them in spite of the fact that they've been shown to be untrue, or they've been shown to be, in Nietzsche's case, the critique is really that they're life-denying. I'll be interested if he ever gets into that. If they're going to publish all of these freely, I'll respond to all of them. And I'm going to be interested in how he deals with the critique of Christianity as life-denying, because it's not really brought up here. But yeah, it's just interesting. So you're accepting that critique, but what's the answer? Just back to church? That's my problem with this. There's never any sincere attempt to actually grapple with the implications
of God. And one would be the collapse of a system of meaning that encapsulated people psychologically and socially. The collapse of that system of meaning, Nietzsche believed, would bring about two events. One would be the dawn of a universal nihilism, right? A sense of rootlessness and hopelessness that would pervade Western culture and provide and result in an intense and pervasive demoralization. That and the dawn of the attraction of totalitarian ideologies that would rise to replace God. And Nietzsche was particularly concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism. That was
so the passage he's referencing where he says Nietzsche predicts this is at the beginning of the notes collected in Will to Power. You can find it there. I'm just pointing that out, that again, that's not from Beyond Good and Evil. We still haven't touched on anything in Beyond Good and Evil, which is very interesting, that he's talking about all of these, his same sort of hobby horses within Nietzsche that he's kind of cherry picked from throughout the canon. But again, it's like, why can't we get into Beyond Good and Evil? He has comments about this in Beyond Good and Evil, right? About nihilism and these things. And it's very funny because he presents nihilism as a consequence of the death of God. But the death of God, in some sense, is a consequence of nihilism. Where does nihilism come from for Nietzsche? It's exactly what I described. It's a religion that puts all the value for our lives in a world beyond, in an other world, and essentially says that, this world, it's a sin-cursed world, it's a fallen world, it's all going to be burned away after the day of judgment anyway. And all of your vain glory, all of your pursuits of your desires for your own selfish ambitions, or for aesthetic pleasures, or even for your even fulfilling your base impulsive desires, that's all sinful. Everything human beings do in some sense is sinful. We're originally sinful. We're stained with sin. And Nietzsche says that this attitude in which the good life becomes impossible in this world, and in which the true world is accessible only after death, produces, and then not only that, but the ascetic ideal that we already mentioned, right? The whole starving of the impulses of the ascetic as the ideal type. This all leads us to, that's what produces the crisis of nihilism. Nihilism comes out of Christianity. It's not we lose Christianity and then therefore we have to confront nihilism because our values have been questioned, and the only thing that was holding this all together was these certain axiomatic principles that we had, and our values, now that they've become questionable, that's what produces the nihilism. It's like, oh, nothing matters because Christianity turned out to be untrue. No, I understand the argument, but that's not actually what Nietzsche's arguing. Is the very interesting thing. He's saying part of why Christianity has to die is because it's created a nihilistic approach to life. He calls Christianity a kind of disguised nihilism. That may be like a kind of poison, can be used medicinally. It might have been the appropriate worldview, the appropriate outlook for a certain human type of human being at a certain time, right? The Roman slaves might have really needed Christianity. That might have made existence tolerable to them. There might have been a time in the world, Nietzsche says that time, the first century, there was an immense longing among the people to unalive themselves, and that Christianity took that and sort of harnessed that really dark drive in order to celebrate martyrdom, or the slow unaliving of oneself carried out by the ascetic, right? The slow self-torture and self-deprivation. So the nihilism it is contained within Christianity already, and it was a form of nihilism that, strangely enough, managed to preserve life while weakening and exhausting it. The problem is, like, we keep taking the poison over and over and over again, right? We haven't realized it's like that was a medicinal poison for a certain place and time, and it's not good to just take poison, right? That's a good metaphor for the way Christianity operates, according to Nietzsche, is that it is a secret nihilism. He calls it, in genealogy, a secret path to nothingness, right? That nevertheless might have been the only way of preserving ourselves, and indeed even of rising above our base impulses. So it has this sort of hint at self-overcoming that Nietzsche thinks is very valuable, but it's ultimately a dead end for humankind. And we're at the dead end. That's why we've become nihilists. The nihilism is a consequence of the Christian worldview. Nihilism is a consequence of the Christian worldview, not we have nihilism because Christianity has fallen.
There's one which is obviously prescient, but more importantly, even than that, was his prophecy that huge swaths of Europe, the Western world for that matter, and as it turned out, the entire world, would become enticed by the blandishments of something like a utopian communism, and that the consequence of that would be the death of tens of millions of people in the 20th century. It's quite a remarkable piece of prophecy.
Still talking about the unpublished note from Will to Power?
Because all of those things transpired. And so the popular image of Nietzsche.
Now, I just want to clarify, Nietzsche doesn't say millions will die from communism. He says he foresees wars over valuations in the future in which millions will perish, hundreds of millions will perish. It's not as explicit exactly the value systems. Nietzsche doesn't call out authoritarian value systems, communism, or anti-Semitism in that particular passage.
Nietzsche is a triumphant rationalist, let's say, celebrating the death of God, but that's not accurate.
Yeah, he's not a rationalist, I guess. But in the way that Jordan Peterson is probably want to understand such terms as rationalism, I'll even go out on a limb and say Nietzsche is a rationalist. No, he actually does believe in pursuing reason and the truth through to its ultimate conclusions. He just thinks that leads us to eventually question, what are the impulses that are driving us to seek the truth? Why is it that we would hold the truth above all else? Why is it that we would make these platitudes about being willing to die for the truth above all? And he explores that, right? But Nietzsche gives us a new image of truth. He gives us a new image of reasoning, a new image of thought, of how thinking works, where thought doesn't think by itself, but it's always appropriated by an impulse. It's seized by an impulse. That's why he comes to this idea, this new image of truth that's not based on correctness in terms of correspondence to an objective world, because Nietzsche argues we don't see an objective world, right? We don't experience an objective world. If we see the world by means of our human head and cannot cut it off, and one wonders what would remain over if we had cut it off. That's from Human All Too Human, right? So Nietzsche is fully within that post-Kantian tradition that acknowledges that the world that we experience is one patterned by our organs of perception. That we're not seeing a thing in itself, a world in itself. We live in a world for us. We live in a world of phenomena. And he affirms that world of appearance as the true world. That's his big flip. The true world isn't the intelligible world of the Platonists or the other world of the Christians. It's this world, the real world, the world of, but which is not an objective world. It's a world of phenomena, right? Which phenomena aren't just objects. They are objects as they are constructed by our minds and patterned by our own minds. Right. So, and Jordan would agree with all of this, by the way. If you go back to his early lectures like Reality and the Sacred, he's totally railing against this idea that we just live in a world of objects and that there is such a thing as objective truth. He's completely on board with this, right? But this is where he gets into trouble because he says, well, for Nietzsche, truth ought to serve life, which is not really accurate. What Nietzsche says is that oftentimes it's lies that serve life. It's often... Truth is like something that your strength is measured by how much of it you can tolerate, right? Because in order to really throw ourselves into life, we have to be enchanted with life. Life is always coming up with new ways to seduce us, to trick us into following after our desires. We become intoxicated with our desires or the aims of our impulses. which make us experience the world in perhaps even a delusional way. If truth is not correspondence to an objective world, it's when we're speaking about truth, let's redefine truth as referring to the world of appearance, which is in fact a world of phenomena, which means it's a world patterned by our impulses and our organs, right? And a very human world, and one that has to be understood in reference to ourselves more so than to like this notion of objectivity or something like that, or of a world in itself. So that's not typically what we would call rationalism, but Nietzsche would say that he arrives at that view of truth by a rational road. He doesn't arrive at it by mysticism. He doesn't arrive at it by just making an artistic falsification of reality. He says that ultimately it is our reason that has disclosed this to us. Our reason has disclosed the limitations of our own reason. It's very interesting to understand Nietzsche as an inheritor of Kant in many ways.
Accurate representation in the least. He was a much wiser man than that. Now, that doesn't mean that Nietzsche was uncritical admirer, let's say, of the Judeo-Christian ethic, because
he wasn't an admirer at all.
Also believed that deep within Christianity was a spirit.
You could call him an admiring critic, maybe, but not you can't say this he was a more critical admirer, because the primary thing is the criticism. It's not admiration. To the extent that there's admiration for Christianity, it's for reasons, it's like ancillary to his criticism of it. Nietzsche in one of his letters says, "I want to destroy Christianity." He says this explicitly. He writes a book called The Antichrist, in which the entire thing is a lengthy polemic against all Christian values. It's impossible to read Nietzsche as an admirer of Christianity. Now, can you say he's a critic that has some admiration? For example, the saint in his ability to transcend the base animal impulses, thus pointing a way forward for nature making a leap in the form of mankind? Yeah, you can say that, but it's such a...
It was a spirit
it's the wrong way to frame
resentment, slave morality that would view the world as a battle between, that there was what you say, a stream of roughly Christian thought that viewed the world as a battleground between the oppressed and the oppressor, the slave and the master.
So that's funny. They have at this little snippet they clipped out of Jordan's script up there. He viewed the world as a battleground between oppressed and oppressor. That's not actually even what Jordan is saying here. He's not saying Nietzsche viewed the world that way. He's saying that Jordan is saying that Nietzsche viewed Christianity, or a certain undercurrent within Christianity, as viewing the world that way. And that's exactly the language that Jordan uses to condemn like the woke, right? So he is acknowledging something very important in Nietzsche, that you can, many of the things that Jordan would characterize as resentment and slave morality can actually be found in Christianity. Christianity might even be the origin of those things. So that is intellectually honest, but he's not going to talk about guilt and pity and I think like the really deep, biting criticisms that Nietzsche makes as regards the underlying values of Christianity, i.e. that it leads us to nihilism. That's the biggest pill to swallow for a Petersonian, I think.
He believed that Christianity was a manifestation of slave morality that was constantly driven by a form of envy, and that would culminate in something extraordinarily destructive. Now, I think Nietzsche's thought was weak.
I mean, that's true. That's broadly true. But that would culminate in something destructive. I don't think that's true. See, this is Jordan using Nietzsche, because that's not... For Nietzsche, destruction is good, actually. I don't know in a way to say this that doesn't make it sound like sort of trivializing destruction, but Nietzsche sees that to the extent that mankind still has the energy to destroy, that's actually a creative act as well. His problem with Christianity, again, is that it's this dismal workshop of the spirit, that it's an exhaustive process. It exhausts the will to power by simply taking the ressentiment. It's like, oh, it's ressentiment on slave morality. It's like, yeah, did you get to essay 2 of the genealogy, Jordan? That's funny, too. We're still not on Beyond Good and Evil. We're talking about the book after Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morality, right? Still haven't talked about Beyond Good and Evil. But essay 2 explains, it's like, well, Nietzsche's like, ressentiment is like it's like an explosive fuel, right? It's actually It'd be rather dangerous if you have a very resentful populace. So Christianity gets them to sort of take an imaginary revenge because the day of judgment and all of these things. But they still ultimately like need something to do with this ressentiment. That's not like a very successful way of blowing off the steam in the long term for all people and all types. That's where you get into the idea of the bad conscience and the priest turning ressentiment back in on itself. And that he what Deleuze says, which is very interesting, is that it's not the major point of significance in the genealogy isn't that Nietzsche makes a connection between the bad conscience and ressentiment, but that he draws a distinction between them. That the process that's created in which, as Christianity migrated north and started to dominate all Europe, there were many people who were still barbarians. They weren't like in the position of the low class position of the Roman proletarians, or they weren't enslaved. They were often, he says, the strong but botched individuals. These are the ones who first latch on to Christianity, and they need something to do with their innate capacity for cruelty, and the priest turns it back in on them. So they're cruel to themselves. Guilt is you punishing yourself, which is very interesting, right? So again, he says, well, Christianity, it's got this undercurrent of slave morality and ressentiment, and maybe that'll lead to something destructive. It's like, well, I mean, for one, do you just mean like what? Wars, upheaval? I mean, that happens in the history of every society. I don't think it's really that different in Christendom from anywhere else. That's not really what Nietzsche's saying. He's actually saying the opposite of, like, eventually mankind will become so, his will be so exhausted. He will be so tamed and domesticated. He will have become so pathetic and guilt-ridden and unwilling to will even. This vision of the last man, that eventually he won't even have the capacity to engage in warfare, right? That the priest expresses a will to nothing, but nothingness, but at least it's still a will. At least it's still the desire to negate something. Whereas once that's been negated, there's nothing. Mankind just becomes a sort of, Nietzsche says, great ant organizations, just instrumentalized individuals that are machines of production and consumption, and that will actually be locked into this stultifying complacency, and that will be the end result of Christianity, which, by the way, he sees as a further manifestation. The modern manifestation of Christianity is this scientific, rationalist positivism, objective view of reality with utilitarian morality as essentially its blueprint for ethics. That's where all of this ends, and that is all nihilism, right? So I would just love for Jordan to grapple with those things in Nietzsche.
On that part, to some degree, I mean, Nietzsche is a very nuanced thinker, and there's a difference between criticizing Christianity and criticizing Christ, and Nietzsche is ambivalent on that front.
He's really not. And this is from The Antichrist, yet another book that's not beyond good and evil, and where Nietzsche says there was but one Christian and he died on the cross. He also italicizes died to like really emphasize he's dead. He doesn't live. He was just a human being. And so that was it. That was the one type who was truly Christian. Now, does he describe Jesus in laudatory terms? No. He denies Renan's idea that Jesus was the archetype of the hero. He says, no, Jesus tells us not to resist evil. He essentially says, to fast track the argument, Jesus was a hypersensitive soul who couldn't bear to be touched at all. And so this culminates in a religion of love and a total denial of the world, and that Jesus lived in the imminent presence of God in the kingdom of heaven. That's the real meaning of his teachings, is sort of like he lived in total unreality because of a hypersensitivity to the pain and suffering of reality. That's what the one true Christian was. And then all of the other ones are not true Christians. They actually do have these impulses like cruelty that need to be discharged into the world, which Jesus didn't have to deal with. And so the priests then manage it with this dismal workshop, right? But that's the distinction between Christianity and Christians. It's not that, what does he say? He's about to say something in a second here about institutional Christianity. It might be fair
to say that he criticized institutionalized Christianity
for its adoption I swear I've watched this only one time. I just have a good memory.
But didn't go so far as to assume that that was part of the ethos of what was central to Christianity itself. Now, Nietzsche wasn't...
Right, and that's just not true. To the extent that Nietzsche talks about institutional Christianity, like the Catholic Church, he's pro-Catholic Church at the worst point in Catholic history, where he says he wishes that Cesare Borgia could have become pope. He says the time when the popes were fathering illegitimate children, raising armies, assassinating each other, at that time the values of paganism sat on the throne of Christianity. In the very heart of Christendom, there were pagan values. And so he says life sat on the throne. People who were actually, for whatever you want to say about them, they were alive. They had ambitions. They had passions. They struggled for them. It was like Game of Thrones and the Renaissance era popes. And they were selling these indulgences. And what a beautiful period of time. Now, we don't have to agree with Nietzsche on that, but that's institutional Christianity. That was totally against the actual, like, real values of Christianity. So what Jordan's doing is he's reproducing, like, kind of just a common sense critique that is not the product of Nietzsche's genius. He's talking about Nietzsche's brilliant, he's a genius, but then he's putting words in his mouth that really just describe the way that an average person might say, well, you know, I believe in the ideal, the archetype of Christ, but Christians rarely live up to it. Oh, and the institutions and the church, that's the real problem, man. But if we just go back to the doctrines and the values of Christ, that would be laudatory. You know, that's not what Nietzsche's saying at all.
He distrusted systematizers. He was also very
Yeah, he says that in, was that a quote from Beyond Good and Evil? Twilight of Idols.
ill for much of his life. And
why isn't this the Twilight of Idols lecture?
In long bursts, and tended to think for extended periods of time, and then to summarize all that thought in very short bursts of poetic prose. For example, in a book like Beyond Good and Evil, it's not really a book that you can sit down and read all at once, because there's so much.
Give us an example of an aphorism from Beyond Good and Evil.
I often earmark a page if there's something. I write in a single sentence what it takes other men a book
Twilight
to
of
write.
Idols.
Then he says, what other men can't even write in a book. It's a mustard seed issue. Christ compared the kingdom of God, if I remember correctly, to a mustard seed, this tiny little grain of possibility that can unfold into this remarkable.
It's just funny, we're quoting from the Bible now, before even quoting from Beyond Good and Evil.
Structure. And there was a prophetic and revelatory writer. Thus Spake Zarathustra, for example, is written in a kind of intense, emotion-laden Old Testament language.
Also not Beyond Good and Evil. Still, we're getting to,
what
what have we talked about so far?
Intellectual development.
We've had Twilight of Idols, passages from the Will to Power reference,
which is this
material from
work,
genealogy reference,
fairy tale narrative.
Now Zarathustra referenced.
Back into his community with
and
a
the Bible.
revelation at hand. And it's not a good example of the and still in some ways Nietzsche is still a fringe philosopher, because he's got this intense romanticism about him.
That's not true. This is like when just as a side note, when Jordan was saying earlier, you know, Nietzsche is portrayed as this triumphant rationalist declaring the death of God as a triumph. No, he isn't. Hardly anyone will give that presentation of Nietzsche anymore. Partially because of you, Jordan. Now people just parrot what you say, which is like wrong from the opposite angle. And again, as I said, you could read Nietzsche in a way. I don't personally, I think there is more nuance than this, but I would say it's more accurate to say he's a triumphant rationalist in regard to this question than to say that he's a admiring critic of Christianity or something like that. And he's not a fringe figure. He's probably one of the most popular philosophers in the world. So it's a very odd claim. And what did he say right before that, where he was saying
example of the degree to which his philosophy wasn't dry rational cognition, but infused with a sense of creative dynamism and poetic inspiration. And again, that's partly what alienated him from the academic community of his time. And still,
which that's not true. The academic community of his time, a lot of them were romanticists themselves, right? Romanticism was a huge deal. It wasn't his writing style. Yeah, it wasn't as rigorous. Okay, yeah, when he published a work in classical philology that cited no sources, that was a very much in Nietzsche's philosophical poetic style. Yeah, it's true, that was off-putting to many people in the field. But the main problem they had was that it was a a lot of the work was devoted to praising Richard Wagner, this composer, as a revitalization of the spirit of Greek tragedy in the form of a new style of music. So it's not exactly the case that they just thought his style was too unrigorous and there's too much poetry, I can't handle it. Yeah, people in the 1800s couldn't handle romantic poetic authors. Are you kidding me? No, it was because they were like, this seems like you wrote this entire thing to be a celebration of Wagner's music, and it skewed many of your perspectives in the book, which devote a great deal of time to philosophical concepts rather than a rigorous study of philology. That was really the alienation that happened.
More like a character in a Dostoevsky novel, which is something that we'll touch on.
Nietzsche is a character in a Dostoevsky novel. They just put that up on the screen. And there you go, folks. This is the abuse of Nietzsche. Because if you read Nietzsche through the lens of Dostoevsky and the message of crime and punishment, or the devils, or any number of other books, and say Nietzsche's like a character in a Dostoevsky novel, that's just sad, man. Come on, read the man. Let the man speak for himself. Don't make him into a Dostoevsky character.
As we move through this, then you're let's say your typical dry as dust philosopher. So let's walk through we're gonna walk through his biography a bit, so you have some understanding of the structure of his life, and then we're going to position him in his historical context, so you have some sense of what's going on.
Is that AI generated?
Is that
an AI generated photo of Nietzsche?
Then we're going to turn to the exposition of
because this
some
came
of
out a
his
couple of years
thoughts
ago,
from,
so that would be interesting.
Beyond Good and Evil. So he was so ill that he was half blind and could hardly write, and was sick to his stomach all the time, and was suffering from some sort of illness that eventually manifested itself as a psychosis and then a series of strokes that killed him at a very early age. It's certainly also the case that Nietzsche and his philosophical hammerings did destabilize the entire structure of Western civilization, and you could think of him as someone destructive in that regard. But I've always thought of Nietzsche, especially in regard to Christianity, as the kind of critic you really want to have around, because if you're sure of yourself, but your foundations are unsettled and in need of repair, it might be your best friend who comes along and taps on the weakest spots so that you know where they are, and that might be initially.
That's an interesting, almost like using the hammer in a similar way, in a tapping way. So that's interesting.
Very destructive to you, because it might even speed the process of your crumbling, but if the consequence of that is that you can rebuild something out of the ruins that's even stronger, then that's part of the process of creative destruction. And I think that Nietzsche was ironically, I'm pushing it here possibly, ironically an anti-Christian, that he knew perfectly well that the...
Yeah, I remember that line from my first watch through. And it makes me want to vomit, honestly. Nietzsche was only ironically an anti-Christian. You can't read a book like The Antichrist, or for that matter, Beyond Good and Evil, and come to that conclusion. You can't read his letters where he says, my goal is to destroy Christianity, not to test its foundations so it can be built up better later. He thinks it's fundamentally a sick dead end for humanity that he hopes we can overcome. And the unfortunate thing is that with the death of God, with the death of the traditional forms of Christianity, the values don't actually die. That the values are still gripping us, right? In the forms of, like what I mentioned before, positivism, utilitarianism, all of these things. This is how you're using Nietzsche, Jordan. You're attempting to use him to strengthen the foundations of Christianity by saying this is our toughest critic, so we need to be able to respond to him. But then once you go out on a limb and you say, oh, that's pushing it a bit, but maybe he was just ironically an anti-Christian. I don't see how you get that from a reading of the text, an honest reading of the text. For someone who complains about the postmodernists, the post-structuralists, right, sort of reading whatever they want, and everything's open to interpretation. There's no meaning to the text. How dare these people think that? You're doing the same thing that they did, that you say they did.
Defense
honestly, the postmodern writers are far more honest than Jordan Peterson is in his interpretation of Nietzsche.
Rigorous offense, and that if you had respect for some, whether the Judeo-Christian ethos can actually withstand the Nietzschean criticism. We combine that with the Freudian criticism and the implicit criticism that emerged out of Darwin and, say, out of the Enlightenment period as well, then perhaps it's not obvious that anything remains at all.
Interesting, he's admitting that the Enlightenment is not just like a continuation of Christianity in a philosophical form, as he sometimes has held, but that it actually does turn against Christianity, which seems almost impossible to argue against that very obvious historical point. But I've seen him try to argue that the Enlightenment depends on Christianity and is in some way an expression of Christianity. So that's very interesting. But is Christianity still standing? Well, as Nietzsche said in Beyond Good and Evil, the proof that the faith in Christianity has declined is that the Christians no longer burn us. It wasn't too long ago, you go back 500 years, and Thomas More is burning people in England for reading the Bible in English, right? Even that, right? That's giving in to the Lutheran heresy that we can read the Bible in a vernacular language. No, Latin is the language of God, and we have to... it's our liturgical language. We can't violate this. This is akin to, a free thinker or an atheist or a skeptic or a relativist, all of these terms that we throw around. That was the issue of the time for which people were burned. That's not even atheism is kind of what I'm getting at. Like it's very far from atheism. And yet people were burned at the stake at not that long ago for these things. So is that happening in any Christian country today? No. So the level of commitment that there is for Christianity, even when it comes to dealing with open atheists and blasphemers, is not really that strong. And the number of cultures where you have, like the Nordics, especially in a lot of places in Europe, but even a lot of modern societies, even some that aren't Western, like Japan, like the majority of people being born in some of these societies, when you take opinion polls of like the newer generations, they're even more atheistic than the previous ones. And you can look up, I suggest everyone look up Joe Foley's conversation, Unsolicited Advice, his conversation with Religion for Breakfast, where they discuss this sort of myth that Christianity is coming back, like, oh, maybe it's a cyclical thing. The overall trend over hundreds of years is in the direction of secularism and even open atheism. And we can see historically all these phases of this. It's very obvious that Christianity is not, it's not what it was.
So, for example, Jung, we'll return to Jung for a moment. Jung was very much influenced by Freud.
I mean, I'm going to keep calling this out because it's so strange. We have spent more time talking about Carl Jung in this lecture than we have about anything in Beyond Good and Evil. Because we've talked about nothing from Beyond Good and Evil.
This formulation of the unconscious, but he really spent his entire career trying to answer.
So why even say it's about Beyond Good and Evil? That's what I'm very confused about.
Well, on what basis should we erect our morality? So when Nietzsche demolished the structure of Western morality by pointing to the death of God, Nietzsche proposed that human beings...
See, and that too is like very odd. Nietzsche demolished the foundations of Christian morality by pointing to the death of God. It's like, no. In the Madman passage, the madman says, I've come too early. This is like a foregone conclusion. This is something that's already transpired, but none of you are aware of it yet. And in fact, as Jordan knows, the madman's talking to a bunch of atheists in the marketplace. It says in the text, there were many there who did not believe in God. And so they made fun of the madman for saying that God is dead, right? Because they don't even think he exists in the first place. So he's not talking to Christians saying... So then to say Nietzsche is pointing to the death of God to undermine the foundations of Western morality, it's like, no, what Nietzsche's saying is Christianity is self-undermining. Christianity, the morality, the moral germ of Christianity, the real content of Christianity, because you can see a religion as like a mimetic transmission system for a series of moral valuations. The actual content of Christianity, aside from the superstitious trappings and the architecture and specific doctrines and stories and all of these things, that like the underlying logic of Christianity is self-undermining in this way that we've already outlined, leading to us towards nihilism. So did Nietzsche therefore see himself as the one who did the undermining? I mean, in some sense, yeah, he says, I want to destroy Christianity, right? What he's saying, the death of God, that whole line of argument involves this progression into nihilism, in which the expedient form of nihilism of Christianity that still preserved us gives way to a more complete form of nihilism. We exhaust our will to power to such an extent that we become total herd animals, right? So Nietzsche, to the extent that he wants to destroy Christianity, to the extent that Nietzsche wants to destroy Christianity, what he's talking about is the morality of Christianity that produces this nihilistic self-undermining, right? So when he says Epicurus didn't make war against pagan cults, Epicurus was a materialist philosopher, so he doesn't believe in the afterlife, right? He says he made war on Christianity, that is to say, latent Christianity, to the extent that there were cults in the Greek world, not even a part of the Jewish tradition, and certainly before the coming of Christ, who believed in an afterlife in which all men are judged. That was simply a latent form of Christianity. So Christianity is sort of like a supra-historical category. I've already talked about how Christianity post the traditional forms of the religion, utilitarianism and all of these things, the objective world that we believe in that comes to us through scientific positivism, scientific realism, whatever we want to call it, that too is a form of Christianity. That too is the shadow of God cast in our thought. So Christianity is this supra-historical category, and that's what Nietzsche wants to destroy. And that is not destroyed by the death of God. It continues after the death of God. It gets worse after the death of God, this nihilistic value system. So it's like a really fundamental misunderstanding.
Right, because Nietzsche also believed, at least as a young man, that God was a human creation rather than the other way around. And he believed once we dispense...
At least as a young man, Nietzsche never changed that position.
If the values that once served us have now vanished, what else are we going to do but create our own values? And Jung took that suggestion extraordinarily seriously, asking, well, is it actually possible for an individual to create his or her own values? Because that's a Nietzschean presupposition that we could do that. Now, Nietzsche believed it would have to be a whole new kind of person. That's the Overman or the Ubermensch, the Superman, who would be capable of doing that. He knew it was an extraordinarily difficult task. The psychoanalysts...
And I'll just say, I've done a whole video about the create your own values issue. This is another area where I think it might actually just be a misunderstanding. Well, see, that's the thing. Again, I'm trying to move away from this Jordan Peterson doesn't understand Nietzsche meme and towards a more honest understanding of the situation that yet again, we can see, well, who's the real thinker that he's interpreting Nietzsche through? He's interpreting him through Jung, right? Jung thinks that we discover our values because they're just sort of in the deep programming of our operating system in the collective unconscious, right? And that we can't get out of that. It's sort of an eternal fact of humankind. And Jung... So yeah, I mean, that's not really important. I guess what I'm saying is the whole create values versus discover them thing. That's an interpretation through Jung that, again, can be understood. Let's do what Nietzsche would do with any philosopher. Say, what are the impulses that are speaking out of Jordan here? It's, again, the back to church, back to Christianity, back to what's always worked.
What would stop the person sitting beside you from creating their own values and you creating your own values? And why would you assume that those would have any union?
You wouldn't. Nietzsche does not assume that. Again, to refer to what I said at the beginning, he hopes that there will be great experiments with creating values. And he's not a universalist. Jordan is a universalist. He can't help but think... I mean, he should read Beyond Good and Evil, because at the beginning, Nietzsche, when he's calling out the dogmatists, right, these dogmatic philosophers who take their perspective, which arises at a particular time and place and has its own logic according to their own impulses, and then without any kind of historical sense, without any sense for perspective, which he says is the fundamental problem with dogmatists that turns truth on her head. The preface to Beyond Good and Evil is so good. I told myself I wasn't just going to plug my own analysis of Beyond Good and Evil, but if you want a real introduction to Beyond Good and Evil, go look at my channel for the first video on the preface, where I give kind of the background of the work and talk about the preface for a whole episode, because that's one of the most amazing things. In my lectures on Nietzsche's experiment with truth, this January or this February, January and February of this year, I spent a whole, half of one of the first lectures just talking about some of the themes in the preface because there's so much there. And he says that the dogmatist stands truth on her head by ignoring perspective. So our view of the truth is topsy-turvy because we need to have an understanding with every truth claim that there's no view from nowhere. There's no just pure seeing. There's always an eye that has to see. There is no immaculate perception. There's no God's eye view that we can appeal to. That's the same idea that's conveyed in this scientific realist idea that there's just objective reality, and our truth claims are referenced to that, or can be indexed against that, which is not the case for Nietzsche. So perspective is this key idea. And so people are going to have differing perspectives and differing values that come out of those perspectives, and Nietzsche doesn't expect they would have any union. He thinks, in fact, they will go to war with each other. What is that prophecy from Will to Power you were just talking about, Jordan? There's going to be these massive wars over values. And again, for Nietzsche, that's good. Notice how, again, the Christian story that Nietzsche has is the slow decline into nihilism. It's not this build-up to a destructive end, as Jordan suggests. He says, we'll have a contest over values. It'll lead to wars with massive deaths. But in the end, that could be the birth pangs of a more life-affirming world, or a world where we live in truths that are more polytheistic and are more admitting of perspective and allowing for fundamentally mutually exclusive valuations that are allowed to each have their own domain. Nietzsche says in this moral interregnum, we should aim to be the reges, the kings of our own little free cities. Sort of, we might imagine the style of the Holy Roman Empire, right? That these free cities are all allowed to sort of govern themselves and then make their own experiment with how to govern themselves. What kind of legislations will be most life-affirming, life-promoting? Again, many of them will be failures. Many of them will come to war with one another. But that's part of how nature experiments with her creatures, right? Is that many are squandered, many are destroyed, many are used up in the experiments. But Nietzsche says, for him in whom the highest feeling consists of reposing, let him rest. For he in whom the highest feeling consists of exploration, let him explore. For he in whom the highest feeling consists of, say, philosophizing and inquiring into the nature of things, let him inquire. I forget exactly the exact examples he gives. It's also from the gay science. So he says, Nietzsche's not out to say, I've created the new religion. The old thing was Christianity. Now you have to believe in my Overman religion. Part of that idea of that religion, where, by the way, he says in the gay science, how many new gods are still possible? It's a section where he's praising the polytheistic ability, its dynamic ability to bring new ideals into existence. And one of the things he says in that passage is, we can imagine this whole bestiary of ideals that have been given a personified or anthropomorphized form throughout human history, including dwarves and fairies and gods and demigods and overmen and undermen. Interesting, right? He's saying the overman. It's kind of a wink and a nod there, right? The overman is a human creation of a certain perspective, a certain set of values that can be brought into competition and to an agonistic contest with other values. But ultimately that contest will be productive. That's how what advances the species is not, again, stultifying complacency and getting everyone to agree on the same values. What advances the species for Nietzsche is the competition between values. So again, it's just a very odd critique, isn't it? It's almost like, have you really read the books? And again, so I don't think the problem's understanding. It might be in many cases that he actually hasn't read the books very deeply. But again, it's not understanding. It's that he's putting Nietzsche to a use that is fundamentally antagonistic to Nietzsche's own aims.
Why wouldn't you assume that you just devolve into constant conflict? So part of the problem with the idea of gender.
Why would you assume that you would devolve into constant conflict? Because can conflict be constant? Right? Has human history ever been characterized by constant conflict? Has human history been characterized by people everywhere agreeing on the same values? Or are there different states, different nations, different cultures, different empires, different civilizations, different religions, different moralities? That's always been what's characterized human life. Are they in constant conflict with one another? No, we have intermittent, what we have is recurring conflict in periods of peace and war. We have cycles of imperiopathosis and imperiogenesis, right? And that's all been a productive process. Through this these wheels within wheels, nevertheless, the species has advanced, at least technologically. It's very hard to say that, like, morally we have, unless you interpret our morality through the standards, the perspective of the morality that we have now. Then you can say we've morally progressed, but that's sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if the morality we have now is the correct one, then of course we've progressed to it, right? But if who knows what people will be saying about our morality in a couple hundred years, so it's not really useful to make those claims. But at least technologically, the amount of power, in terms of the amount of power man has, that's certainly increased. It's hard to say that it hasn't.
Generating your own values is, well, what unifies
but
us?
But it's conflict, say, well, right? It's conflict that drives that forward. How much technological innovation is driven by war? So much.
You need to be unified. It's like, well, you do if you don't want the Hobbesian state of brutal nature to reign, because...
But that's what we live in, Jordan. What is your argument against the Hobbesian view of nature? Certainly the Hobbesian view of nature is too solitary. It's too individualistic. And in that sense, it's incorrect. The idea that it's like society that brings us together, like the political constitution, the sovereign, the Leviathan, I think is incorrect. But there's always been warring groups, right? It hasn't been all the war of all against all of literally every individual against every other, but it's always been warring groups of humans, warring human groups. And so what is, maybe, that's the thing, Jordan, is like, are you intellectually curious at all about the actual process of how we transcend the Hobbesian state of nature? Do you even ask those questions, right? What is it that gets people to unify around a set of values? And has there ever been a universally unifying set of values? I mean, are you advocating for a world government, or like Kant's perpetual peace, a global confederation in which the entire world is unified under one set of values? Or are you just saying within societies? Because within societies, yeah, people do all agree to the same values, but those aren't rationally assented to, and they're sort of handed to you by tradition. And maybe that's the problem he's pointing to, is like we rationally critique them. Every individual is going to be creating his own values. But that's actually not what Nietzsche says on the society-wide level, that's what he's advocating for, is every individual recreating their values. Nietzsche thinks there will be sort of like nodes who will be a legislatory figure, like Plato or Jesus or Muhammad or the Buddha, and then those people will create the values. And those values will be sufficiently persuasive and compelling. Well, compelling is a better word, that people will go along with them, right? Mass numbers of people will be. You can look at this in terms of religions. I've been rambling a little bit, but this is perhaps the better way to put it, the more concise way to put it. Nietzsche would say there have been revaluations of values many times throughout history. In terms of every world religion has been a revaluation of values. Every major shift in the religious character of a civilization is a shift in values, a new legislation of values. So this happens all the time. This isn't something that, like, we're in this new territory and we'll see if we can create values. Nietzsche would say, we have done it many times. Jesus did it. He accomplished it. And Nietzsche thought Jesus, as Jordan says, was only a man. So from Nietzsche's perspective, a man can create values. That Jesus, you might say that, well, there was some precedent or there was something building up to the idea of Christianity. Yeah, sure, of course, right? Nothing is separate from the whole tapestry of fate that governs the world. But at the same time, it was like, by that articulation, through the power of his example and his speech and his sermons and the image, the idea of Jesus, the power of that, completely... when we talk about a revaluation, what do values do? They rank order things from best to worst, right? Or from positive and negative, you might say, things that we want, things we don't want, but then there's a rank ordering within each of those where there are things we want more than other things we don't want more than other things. And that's what a tablet of values is sort of saying, what is the highest value that's at the top of the pyramid, the hierarchy of values, and there's an order of rank, right, that we establish. That's what our consciousness does, Nietzsche says. It's here to give us mastery over nature, to volatilize perceptual sensations into a schema. That's what we do with our consciousness, is create these schemata of value judgments. And so this tablet of valuations is a rank ordering of goods and evils, we might say, is one way to look at it. You can have other bases for your criteria of judgment too, like health and sickness, like Nietzsche has. But essentially that's what... It's not like it's this straw man argument that what Nietzsche's saying is like we just sort of like create values ex nihilo. No, we create them, but not ex nihilo. We create them. Obviously, there's a certain limitation or certain like constraints upon which that like people are going to value certain things just according to evolutionary biology or like long inculcated, moral ideas that they hold and things like this. And just the natural like sort of horizon of human desires and ambitions, right? That's going to kind of constrain what kind of values you can create. But working with that raw material, what you're creating is a new tablet of values. The creative act is to make a new rearrange the rank ordering of values is essentially what happens. And Jesus did that. He created a new table of values by ranking, Nietzsche would say, things like pity for all who suffer as the highest value, right? Faith is the highest value. All these new things become higher values than these worldly values of the pagan world. So it's not like this is some strange new horizon of like we've never reevaluated our values before. It happens all the time. He says, man created all of his values in Zarathustra. He says, we did not find them. We were not given them. They did not descend from the lap of heaven. And he applies this to all of these legislators of values throughout history. So
if we're not united in our outlook,
kind of a shallow critique.
Then as soon as you want something other than what I want, we are definitely going to be at each other's throats.
Yes.
And so Jung started to delve into that, as did the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, trying to understand.
Is that not what you think human beings are like in the first place? Do you think Christianity like turned that off? Do you not see how Christianity, the differing values of the Christians and the Muslims, like produced the Crusades? Like, what is this idea that there was ever this universal set of human values? It's such a bizarre way to look at the world.
And how it might be that you can see in his own thought the genesis of ideas that might have been the answer to the question that he posed, and certainly were unraveled by other thinkers like Jung, like Freud, like Piaget.
Like, what is he talking about here? This is what I'm talking about, where it's like so little of it is concrete, and it's just this lecture is him giving in to his worst impulses in many cases. As a lecture.
To provide an answer to the questions that all sorts of people have speculated on what might have been wrong with Nietzsche, and no one really knows. Maybe it was syphilis, maybe it was mercury poisoning from the treatment.
I have to bring it up. I have to bring this up. I'm sorry, because I've made this point many times. It's not possible it was syphilis. And I did a whole video on this, but it's just not. The symptoms don't actually match. It was likely a misdiagnosis, but regardless of why a doctor thought that he had paretic syphilis, given the longevity of patients in the pre-antibiotic era, the amount of time that Nietzsche lived after this diagnosis is basically impossible. Like, he lived for 11 years after his collapse. And besides that, as I mentioned, many of his symptoms started at 9 years old. So he didn't contract syphilis at age 9. So it's just it's one of those old chestnuts that people keep bringing up. Like, well, maybe it's possible. Who knows? There are some possibilities. Maybe cancer, maybe a tumor, maybe a congenital disorder, which he does acknowledge. But I just wish, if you're going to teach a course on Nietzsche, maybe look into the modern medical evidence that shows that it's just not, I would even say impossible, but if we want to be more like hedging, it's so improbable that it's like, why even bring it up at this point?
And he collapsed into, a catastrophic and depressive nihilism and then died. And that does happen to people, but I don't think that fits with the facts. I do think instead...
It's like you have that thing that over the screen, speculation about the death of God. It's like, what? Why are you isolating that phrase? What is that? Is that supposed to be a key phrase? In context with Jordan saying that that's actually, he does not believe that speculation about the death of God drove Nietzsche crazy. There's so many elements of the presentation here that are like offensive to me, where it's like, it's slopifying this and turning it into these little like nuggets of wisdom that are not actually, like, even in the context of the lecture themselves, some of the things that are being put up on the screen kind of make no sense. And it's like it was done by an intern at Daily Wire or whoever is working at Peterson Academy making these things, and they just kind of churned it out. And then Jordan I'm sure had to okay this. And so did he not say like, oh, that earlier, that segment where you said he believed that the world was a battleground between oppressor and oppressed, even though Jordan was not saying that when that was put on the screen? Do you think Jordan even reviewed the work they did, or like, did they not tell? I don't know. It's just so weird. Like, so speculation about the death of God. Let's put that on screen. And it's like, speculation about the death of God. Okay, what does that relate to? Oh, well, some people say that drove him mad. But is Jordan saying that? No. So it's just odd. A lot of the production value in these videos, at all modern Jordan Peterson videos, really work against him, man. I mean, you got to understand, production value is like a wrapper, or it's like a candy wrapper. What you actually want is the candy, right? That's the actual content. So when you spend all this money on like a really fancy wrapper and the candy tastes horrible, not only does the production value not help you, but it actually makes me like the video less.
Let's look at the world in the late 1800s,
okay,
in the time period that he...
This is the weirdest part of the video, and I actually love this, and let's get into it.
Lived, because it's a good idea to get a sense of the dynamism of the times and what sort of revolutionary activities were underway and underfoot in Europe, in the West, when Nietzsche was formulating his thought. I mean, it's a very dynamic period. It's at the height of the Industrial Revolution, the utter transformation of the world. I mean, in 1865, if I remember correctly, the typical person in the Western world lived on less than $1.50 a day in today's terms, right? Just barely clinging to the edge of the margins of hand-to-mouth sustainability.
I'm really interested because we actually don't get this information in this video. Spoiler alert, as to why he's conveying these facts, right? So he says, I want you to get a sense for the dynamism of the time and the revolutions. He means scientific or sort of revolutions in thought, not so much political revolutions, which I get the sense he's against. But I'm wondering what he doesn't ever, we're not ever going to get any sort of contextualization of about how Nietzsche would have felt about any of these things or how it actually influences his work. He's just sort of going to give us
a
series of things that he thinks are important. It's a very dynamic time, as you just said.
So let's just walk through some of the cardinal events. So in 1840, in the U.S., the western expansion is continuing into what eventually becomes California and Oregon. In 1840, I threw this in just because I was Canadian. Upper and Canada, Lower Canada merged into a single province. Canada was integrated as a state in 1867.
So these developments have nothing to do with Nietzsche's work. You're talking about like what the U.S. expands. So the political form in the United States isn't like massively shifting. It's just sort of the U.S. is adding new states. Frontier is not even closed at this time. It doesn't close until 1891. U.S. colonialism will expand throughout the century. And Canada unifies. Nietzsche doesn't talk about any of these events and most of the things happening in the New World. To the extent the New World is important to Nietzsche, it's as a kind of metaphor. He spends a lot of time in Genoa, where Christopher Columbus departed from, or where Christopher Columbus was from. But he's often thinking about Columbus and this idea of sailing off into a new world. One of the things he says about the death of God, this open sea of possibilities. Why does he use that metaphor? Well, he's thinking in terms of discovering new moral worlds. He says the moral earth also has its antipodes, so opposite sides, right? So there are opposite poles to the physical earth, and there are opposite sides to the moral earth. And so maybe we'll set sail the way Columbus did on this dangerous voyage, right? That's the sort of the danger of the death of God. But that was worthwhile to do, that you discover this whole new world that's possible, this whole new way of thinking and valuing. It's this metaphor of the new world and exploration that he then takes and imports into his philosophy as a description of what we have to do now that God is dead. The ship has wrecked, and what you want to do is cling to the driftwood, when really we need to swim and paddle for the next coast. right? So it's very funny in and of itself. Like, to the extent Nietzsche talks about the new world, that's what he's interested in. But there's very little, to the extent that Nietzsche comments on politics at all, contemporary politics, almost nothing about America, certainly not Canada.
As a new country, but it's actually quite an
or
old
New
democracy
Zealand.
with an even older history. New Zealand was founded 1842. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain.
And again, I'm not saying all of this has to relate to Nietzsche. I understand you kind of want to establish the times. But all of these events are so unrelated to anything in Nietzsche's work that it's and that he doesn't attempt to get, he's just saying, oh, the dynamism of the time. None of the things that he's said reveal like a kind of dynamism, right? Hong Kong being ceded to Britain. What is that? That's just the British Empire taking land. Is that really evidence of the dynamism of the period? Like, what if I just bring up an example from the ancient world where some coastal city that belonged to the Persians was ceded to the Greeks?
45, Texas became the 28th state. In 1846,
U.S. Empire gets more territory.
Incorporated a huge swath of the Southwest.
Okay, we get more states. Still talking about U.S. getting states. Things not in Europe. Nothing in Europe has been mentioned.
Wyoming and Montana from the UK. In 1847, a physician named Semmelweis proposed that surgeons should wash their hands when moving from patient to patient. It was an
He spins a long yarn on this one. If you don't know the Semmelweis story, the people thought he was crazy. And it's a really interesting example, right? But I'm not sure, again, what I'm supposed to take from it.
1848, the Communist Manifesto.
This is probably the first historical bit of background that actually relates to Nietzsche in any way.
Was published, and so that's interesting as well, because, as I said, Nietzsche.
But why not talk about, say, like the Paris Commune or these developments, right? I mean, Daniel Tutt thinks that was like a formative experience for Nietzsche. Devin Gorey totally disagrees with him, but like there have been other. Tutt didn't come up with that idea. There's that idea is to some extent in Klosowski's work. I mean, there's various people who have said that the Paris Commune. You can look at Nietzsche's letters and the things that he said about it, are right around the time when he's like writing Birth of Tragedies. So, kind of interesting. Like, there actually is a historical event bound to the rise of this new political ideology that Nietzsche actually comments on, and sort of like relates to the background in which he writes and his opposition to socialism and the problem of culture and all these really interesting things. But you're just going to bring up the Communist Manifesto.
Motivated, number one, by envy, and number two, lost in the nihilistic chaos that's a consequence of the death of traditional morality.
See, again, given everything we've said so far in this reaction, you should be able to already figure out for yourself why what he's saying is. It's only sensible if you understand it through the logic of attempting to use Nietzsche for his own ends. This entire thing is, his entire engagement with Nietzsche is as a way of like psychologizing communists or postmodernists, postmodern neo-Marxists. That's it. They're driven by envy, or like we can just understand them. They're lost in this nihilistic chaos in which new values haven't been articulated yet because the traditional morality is gone, right? That's the problem. When really, as Jordan said himself earlier, Nietzsche says that ressentiment comes out of Christianity itself. So is it the decline of Christianity that leads to Marxism? Or is Marxism itself strangely indebted to Christianity? That was actually Nietzsche's critique of it, right? So, although he doesn't mention Marx, but the socialists, the anarchists is who he's talking about.
Do you have to orient yourself with some form of systematic thought? And so what that means maybe is that we're always in the situation of the Israelites in the desert. You know, in the Exodus story, the Israelites leave the tyranny of Egypt.
I just want to say we're getting yet another quote or passage cited from the Bible. Nothing from Beyond Good and Evil. He's not interested in Beyond Good and Evil.
Well,
that's what I'm getting at here.
In the promised land, it's like, well, that isn't how the story goes. You go from the tyranny to the desert, not to the promised land. And one of the things that happens in the desert is that you're enticed into the worship of idols, because you need some centralizing tendency, right, to guide you and to unite you. And so if you lose one, there's going to be a terrible unconscious longing for another. And, well, you see that manifested in the Communist Manifesto. And you all know, or perhaps you know, of the terrible consequences that arose as a consequence of the formulation of that ethos.
So yeah, and it's here that where the other shoe is dropping, right? Where it's like the Communist Manifesto is a revaluation of values. It's an attempt to create our own values after the death of God. And look how that turned out. So the only thing we can do is go back to the traditional values.
It was a new attempt to develop a system of axiomatic presuppositions, right? The basic foundations of a state. So 1848, first women's rights convention in the U.S. at Seneca Falls. 51, Louis Napoleon leads a coup in France.
Was that a good... Okay, so like this is the thing that's so bizarre about this, right? Nietzsche wrote a lot about women and the idea of women's rights. And some of it can be rather uncomfortable. Some of it can be kind of interesting to try and understand with some nuance, right? As my friend Vivian has tried to do. But, you know, it's like, are we just not going to talk about it at all? How Nietzsche saw women's rights? Why would you just bring that up and then not relate it to anything? It's very odd. And then we have Napoleon III.
52, Italy moves towards unification. We think of these countries
Garibaldi
as
unifies Italy.
for example.
So, you know, at least we're talking about European events now. But how does the unification, Garibaldi's unification of Italy relate to Nietzsche's project? I would struggle if somebody asked me that. I'd be like, well, I could spin a yarn for you, but I don't really know. The only thing he's really had that even really relates to Nietzsche is the Communist Manifesto, I guess, even though he could have tied that to a more concrete historical event, like the Paris Commune. It's just odd. It's an odd series of things to not say. You're like, this is the backdrop against which Nietzsche writes, but you're not going to say how it serves as the backdrop.
53 to 86, France and Britain defended the Ottoman Empire and defeated Russia. Commodore Perry in 1853 brought gunboats into the harbor in Tokyo and forced the opening of Japan, a great shock to the Japanese, who regarded themselves as the center of the world and were radically overpowered by this overwhelming technology that the Americans could bring to bear. That's an amazing story in and of itself. 1855, the Bessemer process enabled the mass production of steel. Of course, that revolutionized the construction of cities and the entire industrial landscape.
Actually, that example is probably more important to like all of Nietzsche's, at least political writings, and Human All Too Human, everything in the middle period, Human All Too Human, Daybreak, and the first 4 books of the Gay Science. The invention of the modern process for making steel is so important to like the industrial project and the instrumentalization of human beings as laborers to this industrial machine of production and consumption.
Refinery in 1856 in Romania.
That too, I guess.
A lot of things happening at the same time. 59, the Suez Canal was constructed.
Can I just say, it's like, if you're going to do a whole lecture about like Nietzsche, you wouldn't talk about Beyond Good and Evil. If you wanted to talk about Nietzsche's thoughts on industrialization, what it's going to do to labor and leisure time, and what it's going to do to the perception of like the order of rank, and like how the factory worker sees the factory boss versus how, say, a citizen of the under the Sun King, Louis XIV, would have seen him, like the changing notion of like where authority comes from, not from a divine sanction, but from like economic power. And the fact that leisure time is being sort of like minimized in pursuit of like these people being used up for the sake of this machine of production. And where Nietzsche wondering, where does the socialist heart itch come from? Who's responsible for socialism? And all of his writings on like economics and stuff. It's a very strange period of time. It's mostly in volumes 2 and 3 of Human All Too Human, Miscellaneous Maxims, and Wanderer in His Shadow, where Nietzsche's grappling with these issues. Again, I've done episodes on these topics. So if you're going to bring up all of this, if you're going to bring up that as a historical background, like these new processes for making steel, oil refineries, new technology, basically the rapidity at which the Industrial Revolution is proceeding and accelerating, I would think you would be covering sort of that material where Nietzsche actually talks about those issues. Not Beyond Good and Evil, what does Beyond Good and Evil talk about? Well, you wouldn't know it from this video. Anything in Beyond Good and Evil, which is odd. That you could come away from the introduction video to Nietzsche and Beyond Good and Evil and know nothing about Beyond Good and Evil. But first chapter is sort of like a on the prejudices of philosophers, going after many of the metaphysical and moral theories of philosophers in the past, and then the free spirit sort of talking about this new perspectival psychological way of approaching philosophical issues, and then what is religious, sort of Nietzsche's critiques of Christianity, then these various epigrams, these short little aphoristic sayings, very similar to the first section of Twilight of Idols, as I mentioned, and very much you can understand these as like moral maxims in the style of La Rochefoucauld. And then you have these sections on politics and people in fatherlands and scholars, right? What does it do to you? What is it that drives the scholar is the question for Nietzsche. What are his impulses? How do we understand the psychology of the scholar? And this can also be very interesting to refer to like his critique of philology earlier. And then we get later into what is noble? What does my revaluation of values consist of? What is this new understanding of bringing in the pathos of distance and the order of rank and this idea of noble versus base, which could be kind of combined with health and sickness as like a new, or we might say it's just a different way of phrasing Nietzsche's new criterion of judgment. This is what concerns him in Beyond Good and Evil. Almost nothing. There's some ranting against socialists in there, but I mean, come on.
Big Ben was completed in 1859. Darwin published The Origin of Species, which was...
That's very interesting too. Charles Darwin's very interesting too. But I wonder, is he going to talk about Nietzsche's critique of Darwin or his differences from Darwin? That's pretty relevant in Twilight of Idols with the section anti-Darwin, and also in, I guess in Will to Power, there's like kind of a more expanded section of that. But, why is Darwin relevant? Nietzsche didn't agree with Darwin, right? Most people might not know that. He agreed with evolutionary theories, but thought Darwin was wrong fundamentally about how evolution worked. And this has been going for a long time. I'm not going to go into all of that, but maybe give us that backdrop. Give us that context, Jordan. Why is this relevant background information?
Death blow to a kind of rote Christianity, I would say, because the origin of 61 to 65, that was the American Civil War, fought fundamentally over the issue of slavery. 1860.
Are you going to talk about anything Nietzsche says about slavery, Jordan? Or do you not want to touch that with a 10-foot pole? Right? Again, what's the relevance?
Russians abolished
What's the relevance?
Serfdom, so slavery was rife in Eastern Europe and in Russia up till that point, and it's part of the universal heritage of mankind, right? I mean, it's not the existence of slave-free societies that's the human norm. It's the reverse of that. And the miracle, I would say, of the West is that, and perhaps of the Industrial Revolution, but also of the ethos that drove that revolution.
Nietzsche essentially makes the critique that those filthy communists that you hate make, that people are wage slaves now. It's just slavery in a new form. Anyone who doesn't have 2/3 of his day to himself is a slave. Friedrich Nietzsche. So he says people will be crushed under the wheels of industry practically, while still screaming, dignity of man, dignity of labor. Like this idea that people like you promote, that there's dignity in work, and you should be a hard worker and take pride in that. Nietzsche says that's essentially just a lie to tell people to get them to be tools of a system of production. So is that like, again, it's just him giving his own opinion, his own narrative about history. He's doing the whole thing about, well, everyone had slavery, but the West is great because we abolished it. Okay. What does this have to do with Nietzsche?
Distributed its fruits to such a wide range of people that slavery was regarded as intrinsically wrong, and on a wide enough scale and deep enough so that even people who were economically motivated perhaps to perpetuate slavery were forced, starting in the UK, to contend with the fact that regardless of its potential short and medium...
Isn't the whole reason for the abolition of slavery the fact that it actually doesn't make economic sense given the changing technology and modes of production at that time? And that it's actually more efficient and you get harder work out of people when they're not enslaved. And then also you don't have to pay for their lodge and board and food and their medical treatment, Companies don't want to have to paternalistically take care of their employees. Walmart would rather pass that duty on to the state and have them cut a bunch of food stamps to the people who work for them, right? So it's just, I don't know, man.
Medium-term economic viability.
Again, I'm not saying that's how you have to see these issues, but I'm just wondering again, I feel like I'm just repeating myself. Like, what is the relevance to Nietzsche, especially to Beyond Good and Evil? And is there even an attempt to grapple with how Nietzsche would have seen these developments and how Nietzsche would have laughed at your idea that, oh, well, the British, they transitioned to us, the whole human race, to these new values in which people aren't enslaved. Well, guess what, Jordan? There are more people who are slaves today than there ever were.
It was unethical to the core. So exhibitions
You're going
caused
to
riots
talk about
in Paris because
you're going to talk about Impressionism and Monet. Why not talk about some of the art that Nietzsche talks about?
1866, Meiji Restoration in Japan and the beginning of Japanese modernization, which took place at an extraordinarily rapid rate. First transatlantic telegraphy cable, 1867, purchase of Alaska and a devastating famine in Sweden. That's worth noting too. That's not that long ago.
It's like
right?
he's just
It was
like
a
he's
very
clicking
modern,
through all these because
rich,
he's
industrialized society.
realizing to himself,
Can't
I'm
even
coming to the
envision
end of my
something like
lecture time.
famine
Oh
occurring
fuck!
there,
I
but
put
it's not
all this
that long ago
irrelevant
when
stuff in
the
here,
world was
and I just wanted to
poor
kind of give
enough
people
so
a tour of this, but I
even
can't
in
stop myself from
relatively rich
spinning a
and developed
yarn and
nations,
talking.
The threat of famine was often extremely real. 1869, Tolstoy published War and Peace. 71, the Franco-Prussian War produced a united Germany and Italy from 1875 to 19.
Okay, this is one of the most informative parts of the lecture, because bringing up the Franco-Prussian War, that's actually really important to Nietzsche's development. He served in that war as a medical orderly. He contracted multiple diseases on the front and had to be sent home prematurely. And that was really hard on Nietzsche. And that was really a thing that affected his long-term health. And he had very complicated feelings in the Franco-Prussian War. And the sort of the German military ascendance over the continent was coming, at the cost of defeating the French, who he saw as like sort of cultural superiors to Germany. So there was a very sort of complex set of feelings he had about the Franco-Prussian War. And he's actually a participant. As a medical orderly, like treating people, dragging people off the battlefield and treating them, right? Why wouldn't you mention that? You're giving all this historical background and all these unrelated. He's about to talk about the famine in India, and you're not going to mention the Franco-Prussian War. See, like the only things he said that are really important are like maybe some industrial things. You could go for that angle. History of like how economic development and industrialization in Europe and how that was commented upon by Nietzsche. You could talk about the Communist Manifesto and these socialist movements. You could, in that case, you should talk about the Paris Commune and all sorts of things that Nietzsche commented on. Maybe talk about socialists like Eugene Düring, who Nietzsche responded to directly. Or, what we were just talking about, like Franco-Prussian War. But he's not connecting any of these things to Nietzsche, even when they do have a connection to him, and how it would have shaped his thought. And so is Jordan even aware of that? Is he aware Nietzsche served in the Franco-Prussian War? I don't know. You wouldn't know from this video.
126 million Indians perished from famine, and in 1876, 13.
Also, what caused that famine? Can I just say some shit that's totally unrelated to this Nietzsche thing? That's just my personal criticism of Jordan. Jordan wants us all to weep over the Holodomor and these famines that happened in Mao's China and in Stalinist Russia as the result of poor central planning, right? It's not like, yeah, Stalin and Mao killed people, sure, but it's not like they wanted their populaces to die in famine. These were sort of like, you could say that it was a negative outcome of the communist central planning that was not desired by Stalin. Didn't want to kill off those people. You would want to have a greater, stronger population. It's just sort of like a failure of the system, right? He will then say millions died in these famines, and that's a stain on the economic system of communism. He's bringing up the famine in India. Look into the famine in India. It is a failure of the systems of capitalism. These famines happened when the British East India Company is running India effectively, large portions of it, and they destroyed the local textile industry that from which people were actually able to be self-sufficient and have a trade, and returned most of the people to subsistence farming conditions. In fact, all sorts of various factors lead to the famine, right? Both in Ireland and in India, they basically massively restrict any welfare. They make people who are basically skeletal emaciated, look like concentration camp victims, do hard labor to get like a small bag of rice or whatever, or small amounts of money. In Ireland, they're like, this is to discipline the people, teach them to be self-sufficient, right? It's during a fucking potato famine where people are like, they're trying to be self-sufficient, and it's like, but you would think as like, if you have these values as a pro-social values as a society, maybe come together and help these people when things beyond their control destroy the ability of the subsistence farmers to even feed themselves, right? Jordan's talking about what a great thing it is we don't have these famines anymore. But I just want to draw out a contradiction where it's like, he'll talk about the excesses of fascism, the excesses of communism, leading to mass death. Well, this is a case where the excesses of capitalism and this laissez-faire idea, where the country in India specifically is being run by a corporation, right? A foreign British corporation. And millions die in famines because the free market ultimately destroyed through its creative destruction their ability to take care of themselves in any sustainable way. And in the face of that system failing, they don't give them any aid or any sort of, there's no desire to mitigate the logic of the market, and millions die. So is that a bloodstain on the history of capitalism, Jordan? Is that do we need to look at capitalism the same way we look at the Nazi Holocaust? Because indeed, that was his argument with the communists. Millions died under communism. It's really the same as Nazism. It should just be just as extreme to have a hammer and sickle flag as it. It's like, what I'm trying to get at here, guys, is yes, specifically capitalism has a butcher's bill too, but also so does every system. And this whole idea, so much of what Jordan wants to do is just fearmonger and get people scared of, you should be scared of any kind of government, like economic, like guardrails on the market, because ultimately at the end of the day, communism's at the end of that. Well, mass death in India is at the end of that too, motherfucker. At the end of your solutions, right? Mass death in India is at the end of your capital. I could say the same thing about capitalism, right? And people do. It's just, I wonder, I would say that normally I would be like, is Jordan not educated about this? But he clearly knows about it. Or he just had an intern, again, put together this slideshow of, hey, ChatGPT, I don't know if ChatGPT was really being used when they were recording this. ChatGPT, give me a list of relevant historical events that happened during Nietzsche's life.
A million in China. 1876,
none of
the
which
U.S.
relate
Gilded
to
Age begins,
Nietzsche.
so that's when the Americans really start to march forward on the world stage, the time of the great industrialists and this.
And what a fucking dishonest description of the Gilded Age. It was one of the most severe, the times of the most severe.
Immense generation and distribution of wealth.
Generation and distribution of wealth. That is not true. Whether you think the distribution of wealth should be more equal or not, it's just simply not true that it was being distributed more equitably during the Gilded Age. It's the opposite of that. The Lochner court was giving every advantage to the corporate ownership. The wealth inequality was so extreme by the end of the Gilded Age, and the disjunct between like the styles of life for the upper class versus the normal people and the workers, that at the end of the 19th century in America, we had a series of depressions and large series of social upheavals, riots, unprecedented levels of rioting, the labor wars of the early 20th century, in which, you had like the National Guard mobilized against these striking mine workers. You had people like the people who would later become neocons like James Burnham thinking at the turn of the century, like, America's in a pre-revolutionary state. Socialism's inevitable. And in effect, you have FDR's reforms are in response to the excesses of the Gilded Age. And this idea that we can't intercede in the market. We're going to slash all regulations. It's going to be a dynamic society. It's like, yeah, but it ends up being like this starkly unequal society. And you can read all about this in Peter Turchin's Ages of Discord. Again, just an objective fact. Like the amount of violence and upheaval and riots and political assassinations and things spiked at the end of this period, you know, as a result of the working people just being like totally ground under by the interests of, frankly, capital, right? So Jordan's description of this is just a lie. And again, I don't know if it just comes out of ignorance or what, but why would you say that? They're distributing the wealth during the Gilded Age. That's not true.
In 77, Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, and Bulgaria become independent. Commercial telephone exchange in 78, 1881. Pogroms washed through Russia. In 92 is the first gasoline tractor. The Olympic Games are revivified in Athens in 1896.
He's doing this lightning round of trying to get through all these things his intern or ChatGPT prepared for him. I just want to say, if it's going up to the end of Nietzsche's life, right? I mean, he wasn't cognizant for the last decade of his life, so is it really relevant?
Sports led the way there in some ways.
Sports led the way.
First Zeppelin airship, so now people can travel through the sky from place to place. The Exposition Universelle was held in Paris in 1900, featuring the new artistic movement, Art Nouveau. All right, so that's a bit of an overview of where we are in history, and you can get a sense of the dynamism of the times, especially was a pretty damn dismal, difficult, cold, brutal, miserable, ill-fed slog for 95% of people not very long ago.
And then it's over. So like the whole ending, like the last 10, 15 minutes of it, not only has nothing to do with Beyond Good and Evil, but has nothing to do with Nietzsche. And again, I just want to point out, not a single citation from Beyond Good and Evil, not a single idea from Beyond Good and Evil. It's one of the most, and the ending is just bizarre of like, I'm just going to talk about all these like Seward's Folly, as they called it, the Alaska Purchase, the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Yeah, you really got to study up about the Meiji Restoration in Japan before you really understand the backdrop of Nietzsche's thought, because it shows the dynamism of the times. It's just bizarre. And again, I think he gave in to his worst impulses as a lecturer here, because, and what I mean by that is it's that schizo brain sort of relating everything to everything else, seeing everything as part of this like grand narrative that really has to do with him, of him linking together all these disparate things as part of the story he wants to tell. And because of that, being unable to faithfully interpret a text, unable to just honestly read a text, or in this case, even read it at all. Beyond Good and Evil, and even Nietzsche himself, disappears beneath Jordan Peterson and his interpretations of things in this lecture. So I don't know if they're going to make more of them public. If they do, I am surely not paying for them, especially not if there's this first one. But if they do, I'll review them and watch along. You can watch along with me. And as I said, I'm only going to clip the interesting parts, because a lot of this is just it's just the same Petersonisms that he's always used, so it's not even really that surprising. The thing that's most disappointing about this lecture, as I reflect on it now, is that there's really nothing in it that I hadn't already heard him say publicly. And so I was kind of interested, when I heard about these lectures, how is Jordan going to tackle some of these issues in Beyond Good and Evil that do seem to be at attention with his own philosophy and his own approach? And the answer is by not talking about Beyond Good and Evil, by not even talking about Nietzsche. Again, the Bible is cited more than Beyond Good and Evil is in this lecture. And perhaps that's apropos.
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.